Okay, so my presentation and Tarek's will also be in English. It is with great pleasure that Tarek and I will share with you our work on the analysis and modeling of the potential economic incentives for walking towards sustainable active mobility in the Paris region. So the three stages of the presentation are first, we'll show you the importance of encouraging a shift in urban mobility practices, and then behavior change strategies, where we will present the choices we made for the model, and then the model itself. Now, this work is a collaboration where Tarek and I have joined our two research approaches. That means Tarek's agent-based modeling approach and mine on ecosystemic offer-based strategies for supporting walking via mass. All of this with the goal of analyzing and modeling the potential of economic incentives. We have identified that even though walking and active mobility have proven to be a support for transport systems, health, and the environment, there is still a need of creating more encouraging planning strategies for walking, and also actions that actors can apply in the mobility ecosystems. So the original contributions of this work are linked to the methods to assess the impacts that large-scale incentive policies could have with a detailed behavioral model. This to encourage more sustainable mobility. The idea is to support decision makers and other stakeholders in the region by providing key strategies to achieve sustainable goals. To begin with, I think it's very important to clarify why we chose to focus on walking, why addressing walking. So this research finds its place in a context of several crises: social, economic, environmental, and also where much attention is put to energy transitions and decarbonizing mobility to reach sustainable futures, as was mentioned by Tarek and Tarek before. So we believe that this can only be achieved by combining the decarbonization strategies and providing special attention to shared mobilities and active modes, such as public transport and walking. Now, speaking of the Paris region, first of all, we know that in France, people that walk that walk the most are women, children, elders, and people without a specific activity declared. And in the Paris region, nearly 40% of the daily trips are carried out by foot. This is a large amount of trips. To this, we need to add all of the trips that are intermodal trips that require walking to join a bus or metro station, which accounts for up to 22%. So these are both key numbers for our research, since we focus on incentivizing these two types of trips mainly, as I will show you in a second. Based in all of this prior context, we propose to answer the following questions. So how can walking be incentivized to enable behavior change toward more sustainable mobility? And what frameworks can we create that can be used to finance these incentives? So to respond to our research questions, we started by understanding an initial concept: behavior change. So behavior change mechanisms are widely discussed in literature, and what we did, incentives are one of this type of behavior change mechanisms that have the power to influence choices. So we found that non-economic incentives are to this day more complex to model, since they depend on psychological factors and persuasive technologies well implemented to achieve behavior change. On the other hand, economic incentives, for example, price strategies, taxes, and subsidies, or other performance-based economic incentives can be integrated to our discrete mode choice model easily. So we are going to focus on economic incentives. With this focus in mind, we tested the approach by using two different financing frameworks, which are the first one being subsidies, where we propose that the incentives are financed by local, regional, or national authorities, and the second one being a polluter pays principle, an approach, where those who contribute to pollution and environmental damage bear the costs of prevention or mitigation, according to the UN's declaration given in Rio. So we decided to test the impact of the monetary incentives in three specific travel situations. Full walk trips. The second is trips walked to reach or from a public transport station. And the last one is a mix of both situations. So in this summary table, you can see also the last parameter that we took into account, which are the incentive amounts that go from 10 cents of an euro to 2 euros for the three trip types that I just showed you, totaling in 36 incentive scenarios. We propose to measure the following key performance indicators, being the total distance traveled by mode, the modal shift potential, and the CO2 equivalent saved emissions, which at the same time, we monetize to get the total amount of money saved versus the amount spent in the incentives. The idea, and we will talk about this later, is also to push this further in our research to add a comparison with the cardiovascular health expenses that are being incurred. And now I pass the microphone to Tarek to explain the part of the model.
Thank you very much, Mariana. So, as introduced, we also rely in the situation on agent-based models and simulations for mobility. As for the previous study, we focused on the area of bicycle, which is shown a bit here, with agents moving all around. We used the population sampling of 1%, which we deemed enough for this type of study to better have more time for testing different incentive strategies as presented by Mariana earlier. Again, we rely exclusively on open data and open tools, so this study is fully reproducible, and also these results can also be reproduced. So the demand that is simulated here is the travel demand for one average weekday, not a weekend. We reproduce the existing road network and the transportation and public transportation network. And the idea behind this approach is that we extended the mode choice model, which already included a cost, a monetary cost component, to support this incentive component, which is also monetary and which is treated as in the same way as the monetary cost for different trips. So I will not bother you with all these details, but the idea is that this simulation could allow for extensive analysis and really looking into the details of the impacts of different incentive schemes, but rather we will more detail specific incentive scenarios and specific KPIs as Mariana introduced earlier. So the first result that one might look at is the impact of incentive strategies on the tendencies of people in terms of modal choices. In this graphic, you can see a bar plot for each of the considered incentive scenarios compared to a no incentive reference scenario. We only show two incentive scenarios, which are both incentivizing people up to €1 per walked kilometer for all of the trips that are made, either if they are fully walked or in relationship with public transport. And the one ending with -S means that the incentives are subsidized by local authorities or governments, while the other one, which is polluter pays, means that the total cost of incentives is repercuted on the users of private cars as an extra cost per kilometer, meaning that the polluter pays. And the main conclusion that we see at first is that, of course, polluter pays incentive strategies have a better impact on reducing the usage of cars, as you can see in the second bars from the left. But also the incentives relying only on subsidies are able to reduce the usage of private cars. And one other thing that we noticed is that besides the increase of the interest of walking for people, as you can see in the bars to the right, the demand for public transport is also increased by incentivizing the walks towards public transport. So this encourages people to accept walking a bit further to reach their public transport destinations, and thus increasing the usage of public transport. And in this case, I have to also detail that they still have to pay for public transport, and the total monetary interest of the trip would be the cost of the revenues from the incentive minus the cost for taking public transport in this situation. So this is for model share, but using agent-based simulation, we can look into other dimensions and go more into details. Here we take a look using the same taxonomy of scenarios at the impact of incentives on walked distances by people. On the left y-axis, we have the total walk distances for the whole population, and on the right y-axis we have the average per person of the distance walked per day. So we can clearly see that the introduction of incentives with different amounts per kilometer as depicted in the x-axis increases further and further the distances walked by people, and this is even more the case for the polluter pays principle, where we have people leaving their cars and maybe taking public transport for which they have to walk, or even adopting walking as a full mode of transportation. And when we looked at the details, we noticed that the impact of the incentives on walk distances is pushing the walk distances a bit from the bottom of the distribution, meaning that we have much less sedentary people, which are people that work zero distances or really low distances throughout the whole day. And this gives an interesting research perspective on combining this with possible impacts on health conditions and expenses related to health. The last component that we look at here is the impact of incentives on CO2 and CO2 equivalent emissions, which can also be measured thanks to these models. So again, on the x-axis, we have the incentive amounts per kilometer evolving, and two curves, one for the subsidized incentives and one for the polluter pays incentives. Again, the polluter pays incentives enable much more reduces of CO2 equivalent emissions. But this is also the case for the subsidized incentives. And not only we took a look at the total amount of tons emitted, but we have also been able to look at their monetary value. We took the value of 1 ton of CO2 equivalent from the European market of CO2, which was 91 euros per ton at the moment this study was conducted. So we are able to include in the economic impact of these incentives the CO2 in a much more direct way. And from the perspective of local authorities and decision makers, it's also interesting to adopt a view where we have the results for certain amounts of money spent on the incentives, and this is exactly what we do here. So on the x-axis, we have the total incentive cost per incentive strategy, and in the y-axis, for example, we have the number of the amount of CO2 that is saved thanks to the incentives, and this can offer decision makers a much more easy view to deal with and to adjust the policies with. And one of the conclusion is that if we look at the cost of saving 1 ton of CO2 with the incentives, it is much higher than just its price on the European market. But in this study, we would not only consider the CO2 impact, but also impacts on other dimensions. And one interesting thing that we noted is that an incentive of €1 per kilometer for all trips that is not funded by polluters would result in around €10 million per day, which for the context represent 35% of the daily budgets of Île-de-France mobility, which is 11 billion a year. So this is also interesting to offer us a global vision of economic impacts and implication of these incentives. So to conclude, on the more mobility-oriented implications of this study is that to enable behavior change, there is a need for transversal policy efforts and, of course, coordination among various stakeholders, a coordination which is facilitated by this type of works where we combine different perspectives and models with results that can be appealing to decision makers. And also the fact that the impact of these incentives needs to be analyzed while taking into account the rebound effects on other users, which can magnify or not these impacts. And in the scope of mobility as a service, where coordination and collaboration is facilitated between stakeholders, where local authorities can have information about distances walked by people and usage of public transport. All of this can facilitate the implementation of such incentive on a localized level. And for the more research-oriented implications of this work, this is, to our knowledge, the first work where economic incentives have been really assessed in details regarding the impact of both travelers and stakeholders, and this ought to be pursued in the future. Of course, our research is highly extensible and completely reproducible. And this has been the topic of deliverable 3.4 of the Anthropolis chair, and in collaboration with Sebastian Hord, it has also been the scope of a research paper that has been submitted for presentation at the TRB annual meeting. And of course, we can have a lot of perspectives. Here we highlight a few ones. The first would be to test on larger population samples. This has not been done yet due to constraint of execution times, and also extend the socioeconomic analysis using the socio-professional categories and also the personas that were introduced by Tarek earlier, so that we can have different ideas of the impact on incentives on different types of personas. And it could also be interesting to investigate the incentives for public transport, not as a whole revenue, but just as a discount on the price of public transport. So to avoid people ever really gaining money, so to speak. And another point of extension would be to have incentives that are differentiated by geographical location, time of the day, and traveler characteristics to have a more diverse view. And the last point would also to include bikers and cyclists into the incentivized mode, because they are also an active mode that ought to be considered by these incentives. So this is it for our presentation. I thank you for your attention, and we would be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.